Hello, and welcome to another gentle descent into the past. Tonight, we'll open the doors to a world once lost, now rediscovered through quiet storytelling. Perhaps you're lying still beneath the covers, or letting the last hours of the day melt away. Either way, I'm honoured to have you here. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from. Are we continents apart, or just a few time zones away? Both listening as the stars come out. If you enjoy resting to soft-spoken tales and thoughtful history, be sure to subscribe. There's so much more to uncover together. So in this video, I'm going to reveal the untold truth about Isabella of Castile, the queen who literally forged an empire through fire and steel. This isn't just another boring history lesson. This is the story of how one woman's ruthless determination changed the course of human civilization forever. What I'm going to do is walk you through her incredible rise to power, and then show you exactly how she used strategies that would make modern political masterminds jealous. But first, let me paint you a picture so you understand just how impossible her situation really was. Picture this. It's 1474, and 15-year-old Isabella is standing in a crumbling castle, watching her kingdom tear itself apart. Nobles are fighting in the streets, the treasury is empty, and her own brother has just died under mysterious circumstances, leaving the throne of Castile in chaos. Most people would have run. Most people would have given up. Isabella looked at this disaster and saw opportunity. By the time she was done, this teenage girl had united Spain, expelled an entire religious population, funded Christopher Columbus's voyage to the New World, and created an empire that would dominate global politics for centuries. Her methods were so effective that modern historians still study her playbook. She didn't just become queen, she became the architect of the Spanish Golden Age. Here's what makes this even more incredible. Isabella wasn't supposed to inherit anything. She was the spare heir, the backup plan, the girl who was supposed to marry some foreign prince and disappear into obscurity. But through a combination of brilliant political maneuvering, strategic marriages, and yes, absolutely ruthless tactics, she not only claimed the throne but transformed it into something unrecognizable. I've spent countless hours diving deep into the primary sources, the letters, the diplomatic records, the eyewitness accounts that most people never see. What I discovered will completely change how you think about medieval power, about women in history, and about what it really takes to build an empire. This isn't the sanitized version they teach in schools. This is the raw, unfiltered story of how women in Europe. Now Isabella of Castile became the most powerful. To understand how Isabella achieved the impossible, we need to go back to where it all began. The year is 1451, and Isabella is born into a world that's about to explode. Her father, John II of Castile, rules over a kingdom that's barely holding together. The nobles are constantly rebelling, the economy is in shambles, and everyone knows that when the king dies, there's going to be a bloodbath over succession. But here's where Isabella's older story gets interesting. Brother Henry becomes king when their father dies, and immediately everything goes wrong. Henry IV, they call him, though the nobles have a much less flattering nickname for him. They whisper that he's weak, that he can't produce a legitimate heir, that his wife's daughter might not even be his child. The kingdom is fracturing, and Isabella is watching all of this unfold from the sidelines. Now, most princesses in medieval Europe lived pretty predictable lives. They learned to embroider, they studied languages, they prepared for marriage alliances that would benefit their kingdoms. Isabella did all of those things, but she was also doing something else. She was studying power. She was watching how her brother's weakness was destroying the kingdom, and she was learning from every mistake he made. The turning point comes in 1468. Isabella is 17 years old, and her brother Henry is trying to arrange her marriage to Alfonso V of Portugal. This isn't unusual. Royal marriages are political tools. Everyone knows this. But Isabella does something that shocks everyone. She refuses. Not politely, not diplomatically, but absolutely and completely. She tells her brother that she will choose her own husband, and if he tries to force her, she'll resist. This is where we see the first glimpse of the woman who would reshape Europe. Most people think medieval princesses were powerless, but Isabella understood something crucial. She knew that her value as a marriage prospect was also her leverage. Every foreign prince who wanted to marry her represented a potential alliance for Castile. By controlling her own marriage, she was essentially controlling Castile's foreign policy. But refusing her brother's choice was just the beginning. Isabella had been secretly negotiating with Ferdinand of Aragon, the prince of the neighbouring kingdom. Now, this wasn't a love story, though they would later develop genuine affection for each other. This was pure political calculation. Aragon and Castile together could unite most of Spain under one crown. The marriage wouldn't just join two people, it would create a superpower. The secret negotiations had to be incredibly careful. If Henry discovered what Isabella was planning, he could have her arrested, locked away, or married off immediately to prevent the alliance. So Isabella used a network of loyal nobles, trusted servants, and church officials to carry messages back and forth. She was essentially running a covert intelligence operation while maintaining the facade of an obedient princess. Ferdinand was equally committed to the plan, but he had his own challenges. His father, John II of Aragon, was fighting a civil war against Catalan rebels. Aragon needed Castile's support desperately, but Ferdinand couldn't appear too eager because that would weaken his negotiating position. So both Isabella and Ferdinand had to play a cake game where this delended to have they pret other options while secretly working toward the same goal. The actual wedding negotiations read like something from a spy novel. Messages hidden in prayer books, midnight meetings in monastery gardens, codes embedded in seemingly innocent letters about religious matters. Isabella and Ferdinand were both teenagers, but they were orchestrating one of the most important political alliances in European history. Finally, in her move. She tells 1469, Isabella makes her brother that she's going on a religious pilgrimage, but instead she travels to Valladolid, where Ferdinand is waiting. The wedding ceremony happens in secret, with only a handful of witnesses. When Henry finds out, he's furious, but it's too late. Isabella and Ferdinand are married, and suddenly the balance of power in Spain has completely shifted. But getting married was actually the easy part. Now Isabella had to survive her brother's wrath, claim her inheritance when he died, and somehow unite two kingdoms that had been rivals for centuries. The odds against her were astronomical. Henry immediately declared her disinherited and named his daughter Juana as his successor instead. This creates a succession crisis that will define the next phase of Isabella's life. She has Ferdinand's support, but Ferdinand brings his own complications. The Aragonese nobles don't trust Castile, the Castilian nobles don't trust Aragon, and everyone is suspicious of a foreign prince having influence over their future queen. Isabella has to prove that she can rule independently while also maintaining the alliance that makes her strong enough to rule at all. What happens next is a masterclass in medieval political warfare. Isabella doesn't just wait for her brother to die and hope for the best. She starts building her own power base, cultivating relationships with nobles who are dissatisfied with Henry's rule, making promises about how she'll govern differently, and most importantly, demonstrating that she has the strength and intelligence to actually deliver on those promises. She faces her first real test in 1470, when a group of rebellious nobles try to use her as a figurehead for their uprising against Henry. This is incredibly dangerous territory. If she joins the rebellion and it fails, she'll be executed as a traitor. If she refuses to join, she might miss her chance to claim power. And if she joins, but the nobles try to control her, she'll end up as a puppet ruler instead of a real queen. Isabella's solution is brilliant. She agrees her terms. She ins to support the rebellion. but only honest on having command authority over any military actions taken in her name. She demands that all major decisions be approved by her personally. She essentially takes over the rebellion from the inside, turning what could have been a tool for manipulating her into a tool for demonstrating her leadership capabilities. The rebellion ultimately fails, but Isabella emerges from it stronger than before. The nobles who participated have seen that she's not just a pretty face or a convenient symbol. She's a leader who can make hard decisions under pressure. She's someone who can be trusted with real power, and perhaps most importantly, she's someone who won't be controlled by anyone else's agenda. By 1474, when Henry finally dies, Isabella has spent 6 years preparing for this moment. She's built alliances, proven her competence, and positioned herself as the legitimate heir, despite Henry's attempts to disinherit her. But claiming the throne and actually ruling are two completely different challenges. The moment Henry's death is announced, Isabella faces the most crucial decision of her life. Juana, Henry's daughter, also claims the throne, and she has powerful supporters, including the King of Portugal, who wants to marry her and control Castile through her. Isabella has to move fast, but she also has to move smart. She's in Segovia when she gets the news, and within hours she's proclaimed herself Queen of Castile in a ceremony that's both legally questionable and politically brilliant. She doesn't wait for approval from the nobles. She doesn't negotiate with potential rivals. She simply takes the crown and dares anyone to challenge her. It's an incredibly bold move that could have backfired spectacularly, but Isabella has calculated that bold action is less risky than hesitation. The coronation ceremony itself sends a powerful message. Isabella carries the sword of state herself, a symbol traditionally reserved for kings. She's announcing to everyone present that she intends to rule as a monarch in her own right, not as a queen consort or a figurehead. This isn't just symbolism, it's a declaration of war against anyone who thinks they can manipulate or control her. But symbols and ceremonies don't win wars, and Isabella is about to face the biggest military challenge of her career. Juana's supporters aren't going to accept Isabella's coronation quietly. They're preparing for a civil war that will determine not just who rules Castile, but what kind of kingdom Castile will become. The civil war that follows is unlike anything medieval Spain has ever seen. This isn't just a dispute between rival claimants, it's a battle for the soul of the kingdom. On one side, you have Isabella and Ferdinand, representing a vision of centralized monarchy where the crown has real power over the nobility. On the other side, you have Juana and her Portuguese supporters, backed by Castilian nobles who prefer a weak monarch they can control. The war begins almost immediately, and Isabella quickly discovers that being proclaimed queen and actually controlling her kingdom are completely different things. Large parts of Castile refuse to recognize her authority. The Portuguese army crosses the border to support Juana's claim. Some of Isabella's own nobles are secretly negotiating with the enemy, ready to switch sides the moment it looks like she might lose. But here's where Isabella's years of preparation start to pay off. While her enemies are fighting a traditional medieval war, focused on capturing castles and controlling territory, Isabella is fighting a modern war focused on winning hearts and minds. She understands that legitimacy isn't just about bloodlines and legal documents. It's about convincing people that you're the right person to solve their problems. Isabella spends the early months of the war traveling constantly, visiting towns and cities that are still loyal to her, meeting with local leaders, listening to their concerns, and making specific promises about how her reign will improve their lives. She's not just asking for their support, she's earning it by demonstrating that she understands their needs better than her rival does. Meanwhile, Juana is essentially invisible. She's protected by Portuguese soldiers, surrounded by foreign advisors, and completely disconnected from the daily reality of Castilian life. Isabella makes sure everyone knows this. Her supporters spread stories about how Juana can't even speak proper Castilian anymore, how she's become more Portuguese than Spanish, how she'll turn Castile into a Portuguese colony if she wins. The propaganda war is just as important as the military campaign, and Isabella is winning both. She's not just fighting for the throne, she's fighting for the right to define what it means to be Spanish. This is bigger than a succession dispute. It's the birth of a national identity. The turning point comes at the Battle of Toro in 1476. Ferdinand commands the military forces while Isabella handles the political and logistical side of the war effort. The battle itself is inconclusive from a tactical standpoint. Both sides claim victory, but strategically, it's a disaster for Juana's cause. The Portuguese army fails to achieve the decisive victory they needed to break Isabella's resistance, and their failure convinces many neutral nobles to finally choose sides. Isabella's response to Toro shows exactly why she's going to win this war. Instead of celebrating or resting, she immediately launches a diplomatic offensive designed to isolate Portugal and cut off Juana's foreign support. She sends envoys to France, to England, to the Castilian affairs threatens Holy Roman Empire, arguing that Portuguese interference the balance of power across all of Europe. This is sophisticated international diplomacy, the kind of thing that usually takes decades of experience to master. Isabella is 25 years old, she's been queen for less than 2 years, and she's outmaneuvering seasoned diplomats who've been playing these games their entire careers. She understands that the civil war in Castile isn't just a local conflict, it's part of a larger European struggle for influence and territory. The diplomatic campaign works. France, which had been considering an alliance with Portugal, decides to stay neutral. England offers to mediate the dispute, which is effectively recognition of Isabella as the legitimate queen, since you don't mediate with rebels, you mediate between sovereign rulers. The Holy Roman Empire begins making friendly overtures toward Isabella and Ferdinand's regime. By 1477, Juana's cause is collapsing. The Portuguese are exhausted from fighting an expensive war with no clear path to victory. Many of the Castilian nobles who initially supported Juana are quietly reaching out to Isabella's representatives, looking for terms that will allow them to switch sides without losing their lands and titles. Isabella could have been vindictive. She could have executed the traitors, confiscated their property, and used their punishment as an example to future rebels. Instead, she chooses a different strategy. She offers amnesty to almost everyone who joins her cause, even former enemies who fought against her for years. But this isn't weakness or mercy, it's calculated political genius. Every noble who accepts Isabella's amnesty becomes invested in her success, because if she falls, their previous treason will be remembered and punished by whoever replaces her. By forgiving her enemies, Isabella transforms them into some of her most reliable supporters. They owe their livesosity, and they know and fortunes to her generate. The final phase of the Civil War demonstrates Isabella's growing mastery of psychological warfare. Instead of trying to crush Juana's remaining forces through military action, Isabella launches what we might recognize today as a hearts and minds campaign. She travels to regions that are still contested, not with an army, but with a small entourage that includes judges, administrators, and representatives from the church. In each town and village, Isabella holds court. She listens to legal disputes that have been unresolved for years. She addresses complaints about corrupt local officials. She makes decisions about tax disputes and property conflicts. She's not just acting like a queen, she's demonstrating what good government looks like. People begin to understand that supporting Isabella isn't just about choosing the rightful heir. It's about choosing competent leadership. The contrast with Juana becomes more obvious every day. While Isabella is solving problems and making life better for ordinary Castilians, Juana remains isolated in Portuguese-controlled territory, surrounded by foreign advisors who don't understand local customs or speak the language properly. Isabella's supporters spread stories about Juana's disconnection from Spanish culture, but they don't need to exaggerate. The contrast is real and obvious to anyone paying attention. By 1479, the war is effectively over. Portugal agrees to the Treaty of Alcacovas, which formally recognizes Isabella as Queen of Castile and ends Portuguese support for Juana's claim. Juana herself renounces her claims to the Castilian throne and enters a convent, effectively ending the succession dispute that has torn the kingdom apart for 5 years. But Isabella's victory in the Civil War is just the beginning of her transformation of Spain. Now she has to deal with the underlying problems that made the Civil War possible in the first place. The nobility is still too powerful and independent. The church is corrupt and politically divided. The economy is in ruins after years of warfare. Criminal gangs control large areas of the countryside. The legal system is inconsistent and unreliable. Most new monarchs would focus on enjoying their victory and consolidating their power. Isabella immediately begins the most ambitious program of governmental reform in medieval European history. She's not content to simply rule the Spain she inherited. She's determined to create the Spain she envisions. The first target is the nobility. Isabella understands that powerful nobles who can raise private armies and defy royal authority will always be a threat to centralized government. But she also knows that she can't simply crush the nobility without destroying the military and administrative structure that keeps the kingdom functioning. Her solution is brilliant in its subtlety. Instead of attacking noble privileges directly, Isabella creates alternative power structures that gradually make noble independence irrelevant. She establishes royal courts in major cities, staffed with professional judges who answer only to the crown. She creates a network of royal administrators who report directly to her, bypassing traditional noble hierarchies. She builds up the merchant class and the urban middle class, giving them royal protection in exchange for their loyalty to the crown rather than to local nobles. The nobles find themselves competing with royal institutions for influence and authority, and royal institutions have advantages that noble power structures can't match. Royal courts are more reliable than noble justice because they follow consistent laws rather than personal whims. Royal administrators are more competent than noble officials because they're chosen for merit rather than family connections. Royal protection is more valuable than noble patronage because the crown has more resources and broader authority. Within a decade, Isabella has fundamentally altered the balance of power in Castile without fighting a single major battle against the nobility. The nobles still have their titles and their lands, but they no longer have the independent political authority that made them dangerous to royal power. They've become part of a royal system rather than competitors with royal authority. The church presents an even more complex challenge. Unlike the nobility, which is primarily a political problem, the church represents both spiritual authority and enormous economic power. The Catholic Church owns roughly a third of all land in Castile, controls vast wealth through tithes and donations, and maintains its own legal system that operates independently of royal courts. Most importantly, the Church has the power to legitimize or delegitimize royal authority through its teachings and ceremonies. Isabella's approach to church reform reveals her sophisticated understanding of power dynamics. She doesn't challenge the Church's spiritual authority, which would be both politically dangerous and personally offensive to her genuine religious beliefs. Instead, she focuses on administrative corruption and political independence. She begins appointing her own candidates to key church positions, ensuring that religious leaders are loyal to the crown as well as to Rome. The transformation begins with individual cases that seem small but carry enormous symbolic weight. Take the case of Archbishop Alfonso Carrillo of Toledo, one of the most powerful churchmen in Spain. Carrillo had supported Isabella during the Civil War, but he expects his support to be rewarded with continued independence from royal oversight. When Isabella begins investigating corruption in his archdiocese and demanding financial accountability, Carrillo realizes that the new queen operates very differently from previous monarchs. The confrontation comes to a head when Carrillo refuses to provide detailed records of church finances in his territory. Isabella's response is swift and decisive. She doesn't attack Carrillo directly or challenge his religious authority. Instead, she simply stops consulting him on political matters. begins appointing other church officials to positions he previously controlled, and makes it clear that royal favour depends on royal cooperation. Carrillo attempts to rally other church leaders against what he calls royal interference in church affairs. But Isabella has been preparing for this moment. She's already secured support from reform-minded churchmen who are genuinely concerned about corruption and political manipulation within the church hierarchy. When Carrillo calls for resistance to royal oversight, he finds himself isolated and outnumbered by his own colleagues. The lesson spreads quickly through the church hierarchy. Isabella isn't anti-religious or anti-church, but she won't tolerate church officials who think they can operate independent of royal authority. Within a few years, the Spanish church becomes one of Isabella's most reliable institutional supporters, because church leaders understand that cooperation brings rewards, while resistance brings isolation. Economic reform proves even more challenging than political reform. The Civil War has devastated trade, emptied the royal treasury, and destroyed confidence in Castilian currency. Merchants are reluctant to invest in long-term projects when they're not sure the government will survive. Farmers are producing less because bandits and soldiers have been stealing their crops for years. The taxation system is chaotic, with different regions paying different rates and local officials keeping portions of what they collect for themselves. Isabella attacks these problems systematically, starting with the most visible issues that affect ordinary people's daily lives. Highway robbery has become so common that merchants travel in armed convoys, making trade expensive and dangerous. Isabella creates a new royal police force called the Santa Hermandad, the Holy Brotherhood, which has authority to pursue criminals across regional boundaries and noble territories. The Santa Hermandad represents a revolutionary concept in medieval law enforcement. Traditional justice was local and personal, administered by whoever controlled a particular territory according to their own rules and preferences. The Santa Hermandad operates under royal authority with standardized procedures and punishments that apply equally throughout Castile. The results are dramatic and immediate. Within 2 years, the major trade routes are safe enough for individual merchants to travel without armed escorts. Commerce begins flowing again, bringing tax revenue and economic confidence. But more importantly, ordinary Castilians see concrete evidence that royal authority can solve problems that local authorities couldn't or wouldn't address. Isabella uses this success to build support for more ambitious reforms. She standardizes weights and measures across the kingdom, eliminating the confusion and fraud that plagued commercial transactions when every region used different systems. She establishes royal courts in major commercial centers with judges trained specifically in commercial law, providing reliable and efficient resolution of business disputes. The currency reform demonstrates Isabella's growing confidence and sophistication. Castilian money has become almost worthless because previous monarchs debased the coinage to fund their wars and projects. Isabella takes the opposite approach. She recalls all existing currency and issues new coins with higher precious metal content, backed by royal guarantee of their value. This is an enormous financial risk. If people don't trust the new currency, the entire monetary system could collapse, destroying what's left of the Castilian economy. But Isabella has calculated that her growing reputation for competence and reliability will translate into confidence in royal currency. She's betting her political future on the belief that Castilians now trust her government enough to accept its money. The gamble pays off spectacularly. The new currency becomes accepted not just within Castile, but in neighbouring kingdoms where merchants prefer Castilian coins to their own debased currency. This success brings international recognition of Isabella's government and makes Castile an attractive partner for trade agreements and diplomatic alliances. But economic success creates new challenges that test Isabella's political skills in unexpected ways. As trade increases and cities grow, a new merchant class emerges with wealth and ambitions that don't fit traditional social hierarchies. These merchants want political influence that matches their economic importance, but the noble class resents sharing power with people they consider social inferiors. Isabella's solution reveals her deep understanding of social dynamics. Instead of choosing sides between nobles and merchants, she creates new institutions that give both groups what they want, while ensuring that royal authority remains supreme. She establishes city councils with both noble and merchant representatives, but under royal charters that define their authority and require royal approval for major decisions. The system works because it's based on mutual benefit rather than zero-sum competition. Nobles get formal recognition of their social status and guaranteed representation in local government. Merchants get political influence and legal protection for their commercial activities. The Crown gets local administrators who are invested in the success of royal policies and dependent on royal authority for their positions. By 1485, Isabella has transformed Castile from a war-torn, economically devastated kingdom into the most efficiently governed state in Europe. The changes go far beyond mere political reform. She has created new social relationships, new economic structures, and new concepts of governmental authority that will influence European development for centuries. But Isabella's greatest challenge still lies ahead. All of her domestic reforms have been building toward a larger vision that goes far beyond the borders of Castile. She's not just trying to rule Spain more effectively, she's preparing Spain to become a global empire. The economic growth, political stability, and administrative efficiency she's created are the foundation for projects that will reshape the entire world. The signs of her larger ambitions are already visible to those who know how to read them. The Santa Hermandad isn't just a police force, it's a training ground for royal officials who understand how to implement centralized authority across diverse territories. The standardized legal system isn't just about domestic justice, it's a model that can be exported to conquered territories. The economic reforms aren't just about Castilian prosperity. They're about creating the financial resources necessary to fund massive military and exploration projects. Isabella's vision extends beyond Europe, beyond the Mediterranean world that has defined Spanish politics for centuries. She's looking toward territories and opportunities that most Europeans can't even imagine. The domestic transformation of Castile is just the first phase of a plan that will make Spain the dominant global power for the next 2 centuries. The key to understanding Isabella's strategy lies in recognizing that everything she's done so far serves a dual purpose. Every reform strengthens Castile internally, while also preparing the kingdom for external expansion. The administrative system she's created can be adapted to govern distant colonies. The military forces she's organized can be deployed for overseas campaigns. The economic foundation she's built can support the enormous costs of global empire. Most European monarchs of this period think in terms of regional politics, focusing on neighboring kingdoms and traditional rivals. Isabella is already thinking globally, preparing for conflicts and opportunities that won't fully emerge for decades. She's not just solving today's problems, she's positioning Spain to dominate tomorrow's world. The transformation of Castile under Isabella's rule represents one of the most successful examples of comprehensive governmental reform in European history. But for Isabella, it's not an end in itself. It's the foundation for something much larger and more ambitious. Every success creates new possibilities. Every achievement opens doors to greater challenges. The woman who refused an arranged marriage and fought a civil war to claim her throne has become the architect of Spanish greatness. But her greatest achievements still lie ahead, in projects that will make her domestic reforms seem modest by comparison. Isabella is preparing to reshape not just Spain, but the entire balance of global power. The stage is now set for Isabella to make moves that will echo through history. But first she faces a challenge that will test everything she's learned about wielding power. It's 1480, and messengers arrive at court with news that makes the entire room fall silent. The Kingdom of Granada, the last Muslim stronghold in Spain, has been launching raids into Castilian territory. Towns are being burned, civilians are being killed, and the local governors are begging for royal intervention. Now here's where most medieval rulers would have simply sent a few military units to deal with the problem and called it a day. But Isabella sees something that nobody else recognizes. This isn't just a border dispute or a regional conflict. This is the opportunity she's been preparing for her entire reign. The Granada War won't just be about defending Castilian territory, it's going to be about completing the Reconquista, the centuries-long campaign to drive Muslim rule out of Spain entirely. But here's what makes this decision so brilliant and so dangerous. Granada isn't some weak city-state that can be conquered in a few months. It's a sophisticated kingdom with powerful fortifications, experienced military leaders, and alliances that stretch across North Africa. The mountainous terrain favors defenders, the population is united against Christian invasion, and previous Castilian attempts to conquer Granada have ended in disaster. Isabella knows all of this, but she also knows something her advisors don't fully understand. The domestic reforms she spent the last 6 years implementing haven't just made Castile stronger internally. They've created the governmental machinery necessary to sustain a long, expensive, complex military campaign. The administrative systems can handle the logistics of moving armies across difficult terrain. The economic reforms have generated the tax revenue needed to fund siege equipment and professional soldiers. The legal standardization means she can recruit troops from across Castile without worrying about conflicting local loyalties. The decision to invade Granada represents the ultimate test of everything Isabella has built. If she succeeds, she'll complete one of the great historical missions of medieval Christianity and establish Spain as the dominant power in the Western Mediterranean. If she fails, the financial and political costs could destroy everything she's accomplished and potentially cost her the throne. Ferdinand initially opposes the plan. He argues that Aragon has its own military commitments, that the cost will be enormous, and that failure could invite attacks from other enemies who see Castile as overextended. But Isabella has already thought through these objections and prepared her responses. She's not asking Ferdinand to choose between Aragon's interests and Castile's interests. She's showing him how Granada's conquest serves both kingdoms by eliminating a strategic threat and opening up new opportunities for expansion. The conversation between Isabella and Ferdinand reveals the sophistication of her strategic thinking. She doesn't just want to conquer Granada for religious or patriotic reasons, though those motivations are certainly present. She wants to control the Strait of Gibraltar, the narrow passage between Spain and North Africa that connects the Mediterranean to the Atlantic Ocean. Whoever controls Gibraltar controls one of the most important trade routes in the world. Isabella explains to Ferdinand that conquering Granada isn't just about completing the Reconquista. It's about positioning Spain to dominate maritime trade between Europe and Africa, between the Mediterranean and the Atlantic. The wealth from controlling Gibraltar will more than compensate for the costs of conquest, and the strategic advantages will make Spain practically invulnerable to naval attack from the south. Ferdinand is convinced, but now they face the practical challenge of actually organizing the campaign. This isn't going to be a traditional medieval war where noble armies fight a few battles and then go home for harvest season. Granada's mountain fortresses can only be taken through prolonged siege warfare, which means keeping professional armies in the field for months or even years at a time. The logistical requirements are staggering. Siege cannons have to be transported across mountainous terrain where there are no proper roads. Food supplies have to be maintained for thousands of soldiers operating far from Castilian territory. Ammunition, medical supplies, and equipment replacements have to be delivered to army camps that might be besieged themselves by Granada's mobile cavalry units. Isabella approaches these challenges with the same systematic methodology she applied to domestic reform. She establishes supply bases at regular intervals along the invasion routes, each one fortified and garrisoned by troops who can protect the supply convoys. She creates a military postal system that can maintain communication between the royal court and field commanders, even when armies are operating deep in enemy territory. Most importantly, she revolutionizes medieval siege warfare by developing what we might recognize today as combined arms tactics. Traditional siege warfare relied primarily on infantry to surround enemy fortifications and wait for defenders to surrender from hunger or disease. Isabella integrates cavalry, artillery, engineers, and specialized assault troops into coordinated operations that can take fortified positions through direct attack rather than starvation. The first major test comes at the fortress city of Alhama in 1482. Alhama controls a key mountain pass that Granada uses to move troops and supplies between its northern and southern territories. Capturing Alhama won't end the war, but it will cut Granada's kingdom in half and force the defenders to fight on two separate fronts. The siege of Alhama reveals Isabella's personal involvement in military planning. She doesn't just give general orders and wait for reports from her commanders. She studies detailed maps of the fortress, interviews prisoners and refugees who know the layout of the defences, and works with her engineers to identify the most vulnerable points in the walls. When the assault begins, Isabella establishes her command post close enough to the fighting that she can see the battle developing in real time and adjust her orders accordingly. This isn't just symbolic leadership, it's practical command and control. Medieval battles are chaotic, communication is difficult, and plans rarely survive contact with the enemy. Isabella's presence allows her to make rapid decisions based on changing circumstances, rather than relying on reports that might be hours old by the time they reach headquarters. The fall of Alhama sends shockwaves through both Spain and North Africa. Muslim chroniclers describe it as a disaster that proves God has abandoned Granada to its Christian enemies. Christian writers celebrate it as evidence that Isabella's reign represents divine favor for the Reconquista. But the most important audience is European, where monarchs and diplomats suddenly realize that Spain under Isabella and Ferdinand represents a new kind of military power. The traditional pattern of medieval warfare involves short campaigns with limited objectives. Armies fight during good weather, avoid major battles unless victory is almost certain, and negotiate truces whenever military costs become too expensive. Isabella's Granada campaign operates according to completely different principles. Her armies fight year-round, seek decisive battles rather than avoiding them, and continue operations regardless of cost, as long as strategic objectives remain unachieved. This new approach to warfare reflects Isabella's understanding that military success depends on political and economic foundations that most medieval rulers ignore. Her armies can fight year-round because she's created supply systems that don't depend on seasonal agriculture. They can afford decisive battles because she's developed recruitment methods that can replace casualties quickly. They can sustain high costs because she's implemented tax systems that generate reliable revenue streams. The Granada campaign becomes a laboratory for innovations that will define Spanish military doctrine for centuries. Isabella's engineers develop new types of artillery specifically designed for siege warfare in mountainous terrain. Her cavalry commanders experiment with tactics that integrate mounted troops with infantry formations, creating combined arms units that can adapt to different battlefield conditions. Most importantly, Isabella creates what amounts to a military-industrial complex dedicated to supporting the Granada campaign. Weapon manufacturers receive royal contracts that guarantee steady demand for their products. Shipbuilders construct specialized vessels for transporting heavy equipment along the coast. Agricultural regions are organized to produce surplus food that can be stored in military warehouses for use during campaigning seasons. The economic impact of the Granada War extends far beyond military spending. The constant demand for supplies, equipment, and services stimulates growth throughout the Spanish economy. Merchants who supply the army become wealthy and influential. Craftsmen who produce military equipment expand their workshops and train additional apprentices. Farmers who sell surplus crops to military contractors invest their profits in land improvements and livestock. Isabella understands that this economic growth isn't just a beneficial side effect of military spending. It's a strategic asset that makes the Granada campaign self-sustaining. The more money she spends on the war, the more tax revenue the war generates through economic growth. The more successful her armies become, the more attractive military service becomes to ambitious young men throughout Spain. By Granada, war has transformed from 1485, a regional conflict, into a national crusade that defines Spanish identity. Isabella has successfully convinced her subjects that conquering Granada isn't just about territorial expansion or religious duty. It's about proving that Spain deserves to be recognized as the greatest Christian kingdom in Europe. The propaganda campaign supporting the Granada War demonstrates Isabella's sophisticated understanding of public opinion and morale. She doesn't rely on traditional royal proclamations or church sermons to maintain popular support for an expensive, dangerous military campaign. Instead, she creates what we might recognize today as a comprehensive media strategy designed to keep the war visible and popular throughout Spanish society. Balladeers and storytellers receive royal patronage to compose songs and poems, celebrating Spanish victories and honoring soldiers who die fighting for the faith. Artists receive commissions to create paintings and sculptures that depict Granada's conquest as part of Spain's divine mission. Scholars are encouraged to write histories that place the current war in the context of centuries of Christian struggle against Muslim occupation. The cultural campaign works because it gives ordinary Spaniards a way to participate in the Granada War even if they're not soldiers. Merchants who provide supplies, farmers who grow food for the army, craftsmen who make equipment, and clergy who pray for victory all see themselves as contributors to a great national enterprise. Isabella has transformed military conquest into a collective Spanish achievement. But the most brilliant aspect of Isabella's Granada strategy isn't military or economic or cultural. It's diplomatic. While Spanish armies are fighting Muslim defenders in the mountains of southern Spain, Spanish diplomats are working to isolate Granada from potential allies and secure international support for the Reconquista. The diplomatic challenge is complex because Granada's survival depends partly on support from North African Muslim kingdoms, particularly Morocco and Tunisia. These kingdoms have been providing Granada with military advisors, weapons, and sometimes troops for decades. If they increase their support in response to Spanish invasion, the Granada War could become a much larger conflict, involving multiple Muslim powers against Spain. Isabella's solution is to make the Granada War appear inevitable and successful to potential Muslim allies, while simultaneously offering them attractive alternatives to military intervention. Spanish diplomats in North Africa argue that Granada's defeat is already certain, that further Muslim support will only prolong the suffering of Granada's population, and that North African kingdoms would benefit more from negotiating favourable trade relationships with the future Spanish rulers of Granada. At the same time, Isabella is building European support for the Granada campaign by presenting it as a crusade that benefits all of Christian Europe. She argues that Spanish success in Granada will prevent Muslim expansion into European territory and eliminate a potential base for future Muslim attacks on Christian kingdoms. The European diplomatic campaign succeeds beyond Isabella's most optimistic expectations. The Pope declares the Granada War a crusade, which provides both spiritual legitimacy and financial support through special church taxes. France agrees to remain neutral in exchange for Spanish promises not to interfere in French expansion into Italy. The Holy Roman Empire provides military advisors and artillery experts. Most importantly, England and Portugal agree to prevent Muslim naval forces from using their ports to support Granada. This naval blockade makes it almost impossible for Granada to receive significant military aid from North Africa, effectively isolating the kingdom and forcing it to rely entirely on its own resources. By 1487, Granada is fighting a hopeless war against overwhelming odds. Spanish armies control most of the mountain passes that connect different parts of the kingdom. Spanish naval forces prevent seaborne supplies from reaching Granada's ports. Spanish diplomacy has eliminated the possibility of effective foreign aid, and Spanish economic strength allows the campaign to continue indefinitely, while Granada's resources are rapidly being exhausted. But Isabella doesn't want just military victory. She wants complete conquest, followed by successful integration of Granada's territory and population into the Spanish kingdom. This means she needs to plan not just for winning the war, but for governing the peace that follows. The challenge of integrating Granada represents everything Isabella has learned about effective government on a much larger and more complex scale. Granada's population is entirely Muslim, speaks Arabic rather than Spanish, follows different legal traditions, and has been Spain's enemy for centuries. Simply conquering the territory won't be enough if the population remains hostile and unassimilated. Isabella's approach to this challenge reveals the full sophistication of her political thinking. She develops what amounts to a comprehensive plan for cultural transformation that will turn Granada's Muslim population into loyal Spanish subjects over the course of a single generation. The plan is ambitious, systematic, and ruthlessly effective. The first component involves religious conversion, but not through the crude methods of forced baptism that characterize most medieval religious persecution. Isabella understands that forced conversions create false Christians who remain secretly loyal to their original faith and potentially dangerous to Spanish rule. Instead, she plans to make Christianity attractive through economic incentives, educational opportunities, and social advancement. Muslims who convert to Christianity will receive tax breaks, preferential treatment in legal disputes, and access to positions in the Spanish administrative system that are closed to non-Christians. Their children will receive free education in Spanish schools where they'll learn Spanish language, Spanish customs, and Spanish versions of history. Within 20 years, Isabella calculates, Granada's population will be voluntarily Christian and voluntarily Spanish. The second component involves economic integration designed to make Granada's prosperity dependent on continued Spanish rule. Isabella plans to redirect Granada's trade relationships away from North Africa and towards Spanish cities. She'll encourage Spanish merchants to establish businesses in Granada, creating economic partnerships between Spanish and Granadan families. She'll invest royal funds in infrastructure projects that connect Granada to Spanish transportation networks. The economic strategy serves multiple purposes simultaneously. It reduces Granada's potential for rebellion by making rebellion economically disastrous for the local population. It creates Spanish commercial interests in Granada's continued stability and prosperity. And it generates tax revenue that helps pay for the costs of conquest and administration. The third component is perhaps the most innovative. Isabella plans to use intermarriage as a tool of political integration. Spanish soldiers who marry Granadan women will receive land grants and tax incentives. Granadan families who arrange marriages with Spanish families will gain access to Spanish commercial networks and administrative positions. This isn't just social engineering. It's strategic planning based on Isabella's understanding of how loyalty and identity develop across generations. Children from Spanish Granadan marriages will think of themselves as Spanish rather than Granadan. Their economic interests will be tied to Spanish success rather than Granadan independence. Their cultural identity will blend Spanish and Granadan elements in ways that strengthen rather than threaten Spanish rule. The siege of Granada city itself begins in 1491, and Isabella establishes her headquarters close enough to personally oversee the final phase of the campaign. The royal camp becomes a small city with its own markets, churches, workshops, and administrative offices. Isabella holds court, receives diplomatic envoys, and continues governing the rest of Spain, while simultaneously commanding the siege that will complete the Reconquista. The symbolic importance of Isabella's personal presence at Granada cannot be overstated. For Spanish soldiers, seeing their queen sharing the dangers and hardships of the campaign proves that the war represents her deepest personal commitment, rather than merely another political calculation. For Granada's defenders, Isabella's presence proves that Spain will accept nothing less than complete surrender. But Isabella's presence also serves practical military purposes. Medieval sieges often drag on for months because field commanders become cautious about casualties and expenses. Isabella's personal involvement ensures that the siege maintains maximum pressure on Granada's defenders, while also demonstrating to her own forces that retreat or compromise are not options. The fall of Granada in January 1492 represents the culmination of Isabella's transformation from teenage princess to master of statecraft. The victory isn't just military, it's the successful execution of a comprehensive strategy that integrated domestic reform, economic development, diplomatic maneuvering, cultural transformation, and military innovation into a coherent program of national expansion. But even as Isabella accepts Granada's surrender, she's already planning projects that will make the conquest of Granada seem modest by comparison. The administrative systems she developed for governing Granada can be adapted for governing territories across the oceans. The military innovations she perfected in the Granada War can be applied to campaigns in distant continents. The economic growth generated by the Granada campaign provides the financial foundation for exploration and colonization projects that will reshape the entire world. The completion of the Reconquista marks the end of medieval Spain and the beginning of imperial Spain. Isabella has spent 20 years transforming a weak, divided kingdom into the most powerful and efficiently governed state in Europe. Now she's ready to transform Europe itself by making Spain the center of the first truly global empire in human history. The woman who refused an arranged marriage has become the architect of Spanish greatness. The teenage princess who fought a civil war for her throne has become the queen who completed an 800-year crusade. But Isabella's greatest achievements still lie ahead, in projects that will make her the most important monarch of the early modern period and establish Spain as the dominant global power for the next 2 centuries. The year is 1492, and while most of Europe is celebrating Isabella's triumph over Granada, she's already making a decision that will change the course of human history forever. A Genoese navigator named Christopher Columbus has been haunting the Spanish court for months, carrying maps and calculations that most educated people consider completely insane. Columbus believes he can reach the Indies by sailing west across the Atlantic Ocean. Every expert Isabella consults tells her this is impossible. The ocean is too vast, the distances are too great, and even if Columbus somehow survived the journey, he'd never be able to return against the prevailing winds. The Portuguese have already rejected his proposal. The English have laughed him out of court. Even Columbus's own brother thinks he's lost his mind. But Isabella sees something that everyone else is missing. The Granada War has proven that impossible projects become possible when you have the right combination of resources, determination, and strategic vision. More importantly, she understands that the greatest rewards come from taking risks that other people consider too dangerous to attempt. The conversation between Isabella and Columbus reveals exactly why she's become the most successful monarch in Europe. She doesn't just listen to his presentation about sailing routes and wind patterns. She asks him about contingency plans, backup strategies, and alternative objectives. What happens if you don't reach the Indies? What other opportunities might you discover along the way? How do you plan to establish Spanish authority over any territories you claim? Columbus has prepared for these questions because he understands that Isabella doesn't fund expeditions based on hope and optimism. She funds projects that serve Spanish strategic interests, regardless of whether their primary objectives succeed or fail. Even if Columbus never reaches the Indies, his voyage will advance Spanish knowledge of Atlantic navigation, test new shipbuilding techniques, and potentially discover islands or territories that could serve as bases for future expeditions. The financial negotiations demonstrate Isabella's sophisticated understanding of risk management. She doesn't fund Columbus's expedition from the royal treasury, which would make her personally responsible for the costs if the voyage fails. Instead, she creates a joint venture that spreads the financial risk, among multiple investors, while ensuring that Spain retains political control over any territories Columbus might discover. The contract Isabella signs with Columbus becomes the template for Spanish exploration and colonization for the next century. Columbus receives the title of Admiral of the Ocean Sea and the governor of any lands he discovers, but his authority is subordinate to Spanish sovereignty. He can keep a percentage of any wealth he finds, but the majority belongs to the Spanish crown. He can establish settlements and trade relationships, but only according to Spanish law and Spanish policy. Most importantly, Isabella inserts clauses into the contract that protect Spanish interests, even if Columbus's expedition exceeds all expectations. If he discovers territories with existing governments, he must negotiate treaties that acknowledge Spanish superiority. If he encounters other European explorers, he must assert Spanish claims and prevent foreign colonization. If he finds new trade routes, Spain must maintain exclusive access to the most profitable opportunities. When Columbus's ships disappear over the western horizon in August 1492, Isabella is already planning the administrative systems that will govern whatever he discovers. She establishes the Casa de Contratación, the House of Trade, which will regulate all Spanish commerce with newly discovered territories. She creates new legal frameworks for governing overseas colonies that combine Spanish law with practical adaptations for governing non-European populations. The preparations reveal Isabella's confidence that Columbus will discover something valuable, even if it's not what he's looking for. She's not gambling on his specific promises about reaching the Indies. She's investing in the principle that systematic exploration will eventually produce opportunities that justify the costs and risks involved. While Columbus is sailing towards the unknown, Isabella is dealing with a domestic crisis that tests everything she's learned about wielding power. The completion of the Reconquista has eliminated the external threat that unified Spanish Christians, but it's also created internal tensions that threaten to tear the kingdom apart. The problem centers on Spain's Jewish population, which has played crucial economic and administrative roles throughout the Granada War. Jewish merchants helped finance the military campaign. Jewish administrators helped organize the complex logistics of siege warfare, and Jewish physicians and engineers provided essential technical expertise. But now that the war is over, many Spanish Christians are demanding that Isabella reward their sacrifices by expelling or persecuting the Jews who profited from the conflict. The pressure comes from multiple directions simultaneously. Church leaders argue that completing the Reconquista requires purifying Spain of all non-Christian influences. Noble families want access to Jewish commercial networks and properties. Urban populations blame Jews for economic problems that actually result from the costs and disruptions of 8 years of warfare. Isabella faces an impossible choice between contradictory imperatives. Expelling the Jews will eliminate crucial economic and administrative expertise that Spain needs for governing Granada and funding future expansion projects. But protecting the Jews risks alienating the Christian majority that provides the political foundation for her rule. The decision she makes reveals both the brilliance and the ruthlessness that define her approach to statecraft. In March 1492, Isabella issues the Edict of Expulsion, which gives Spanish Jews 4 months to either convert to Christianity or leave the kingdom permanently. Jews who convert can retain their property and positions, but Jews who refuse conversion must sell their assets and abandon everything they've built in Spain. The edict appears to satisfy Christian demands for religious purification, while protecting Spain's economic interests by encouraging Jewish conversion rather than emigration. But Isabella's real strategy is more complex and more calculating than the public announcement suggests. She's created a system that allows her to eliminate potential political opposition while retaining essential expertise and resources. Jews who convert become completely dependent on royal protection for their safety and prosperity, making them natural allies of centralized monarchy against noble and popular opposition. Jews who emigrate take their wealth and skills to competing kingdoms, potentially weakening Spain's rivals by creating internal tensions over Jewish integration. The implementation of the expulsion reveals Isabella's mastery of administrative efficiency. She doesn't rely on local authorities to enforce the edict, because local authorities might be corrupted by bribes or intimidated by threats. Instead, she creates royal commissions with specific instructions about property confiscation, conversion procedures, and emigration logistics. The royal commissions operate according to standardized procedures that minimize opportunities for corruption or favoritism. Jewish property is appraised by certified evaluators, conversion ceremonies are conducted according to official protocols, and emigration is organized through designated ports with royal oversight. Isabella transforms what could have been chaotic persecution into systematic administrative process. The results exceed Isabella's strategic calculations. Most Spanish Jews choose conversion rather than emigration, providing Spain with a population of new Christians who possess commercial expertise and international connections, while being completely loyal to the monarchy that protects them from popular hostility. The Jews, their complaints about Spanish persecution who do emigrate, take to foreign courts, generating sympathy for Spain's enemies while demonstrating Spanish religious commitment to potential Catholic allies. But the most important consequence of the expulsion is psychological rather than economic or political. Isabella has proven that she's willing to make decisions that cost her personally in order to serve what she believes are Spain's long-term interests. The Jewish expulsion is genuinely painful for her because she values the contributions Jews have made to Spanish success, and she recognizes the injustice involved in punishing loyalty with exile. The willingness to make painful decisions based on strategic calculation rather than personal preference becomes the defining characteristic of Isabella's mature statecraft. She doesn't govern according to her own desires or emotions. She governs according to what she believes will make Spain stronger, more unified, and more successful in competition with other European powers. The psychological transformation is visible to everyone who works with Isabella regularly. Courtiers notice that she's become more distant and formal in her interactions, less interested in personal relationships, and more focused on institutional responsibilities. Advisors find that she's less willing to discuss the moral implications of policy decisions and more interested in their practical effectiveness. The change isn't callousness or indifference to human suffering. It's the evolution of a ruler who has learned that sentimental decision-making produces sentimental results, while strategic decision-making produces strategic advantages. Isabella has become the kind of monarch who can order actions that break her heart if she believes those actions will strengthen her kingdom. The news of Columbus's return in March 1493 arrives at a Spanish court that has been fundamentally transformed by the events of the previous year. Isabella has completed the Reconquista, expelled the Jews, and established administrative systems for governing newly conquered territories. Now she discovers that Columbus has found something that exceeds even her most optimistic expectations. Columbus hasn't reached the Indies, but he's discovered islands with gold deposits, friendly populations, and strategic locations that could serve as bases for further exploration. More importantly, he's proven that systematic ocean exploration can produce tangible results rather than just romantic adventure. Isabella's investment in his expedition has generated both immediate returns and long-term opportunities. The report Columbus delivers to Isabella reveals the full scope of what Spanish exploration has accomplished. The islands he's discovered contain populations that have never been exposed to European diseases, making them vulnerable to conquest by relatively small Spanish forces. The territories have natural resources, including gold, tropical crops, and strategic minerals. The locations provide access to ocean routes that could connect Spain directly to Asian markets, without relying on Mediterranean or overland trade networks. Isabella's response to Columbus's discoveries demonstrates her ability to recognize historical opportunities and act on them immediately. While other European monarchs are still trying to understand what Columbus has actually found, Isabella is already organizing follow-up expeditions, establishing colonial governments, and creating trade networks that will give Spain permanent advantages in the newly discovered territories. The speed of her reaction reflects years of preparation and planning. The administrative systems she developed for governing Granada can be adapted for governing Caribbean islands. The military innovations she perfected during the Reconquista can be applied to campaigns against populations that have never encountered European warfare. The economic networks she created to support the Granada War can be extended to exploit New World resources. But Isabella's most brilliant insight concerns the relationship between her American discoveries and European politics. She understands that controlling access to American wealth will give Spain decisive advantages in European conflicts for decades to come. The gold and silver that Columbus has found won't just make Spain rich, it will make Spain powerful enough to dominate European diplomacy and warfare. The papal bull Inter Caetera, which Isabella secures in May 1493, demonstrates her sophisticated understanding of international law and diplomatic legitimacy. The Pope's declaration that Spain has exclusive rights to territories west of a specified meridian doesn't just protect Spanish claims against Portuguese competition. It creates legal foundations for Spanish expansion that other Catholic kingdoms will find difficult to challenge without appearing to defy papal authority. Isabella's negotiations with Portugal over the Treaty of Tordesillas reveal her growing confidence in Spanish power and her willingness to make concessions that seem generous, but actually serve Spanish interests. She agrees to move the papal meridian farther west, giving Portugal additional territory for colonization. But she retains Spanish control over the Caribbean islands that Columbus has already explored, and she secures Portuguese recognition of Spanish sovereignty over any territories Spain might discover in the future. The treaty appears to divide the undiscovered world equally between Spain and Portugal, but Isabella understands that Spain's advantages in shipbuilding, navigation, and colonial administration will allow Spanish exploration to outpace Portuguese expansion, regardless of the territorial allocations. She's trading theoretical Portuguese rights for practical Spanish supremacy. The establishment of the encomienda system in Spain's American territories reveals both Isabella's administrative genius and her moral blind spots. The system grants Spanish colonists authority over indigenous populations in exchange for responsibilities to provide protection, education, and religious instruction. On paper, it's a humanitarian approach to colonial governance that protects native peoples while ensuring Spanish control. In practice, the encomienda system becomes a mechanism for systematic exploitation that allows Spanish colonists to extract wealth from indigenous labor while maintaining legal fiction of benevolent guardianship. Isabella creates detailed regulations designed to prevent abuse, but she also creates enforcement mechanisms that depend on colonial administrators who benefit personally from the system they're supposed to regulate. The contradiction reflects Isabella's fundamental approach to governance, which prioritizes effective control over moral consistency. She genuinely believes that Spanish colonization will benefit indigenous populations by exposing them to Christianity and European civilization. But she also recognizes that Spanish colonists won't invest their lives and resources in American ventures unless they can expect substantial profits from their efforts. Isabella's solution is to create systems that appear humanitarian while functioning economically, allowing her to satisfy moral critics while maintaining colonial profitability. The encomienda regulations include provisions for indigenous education, legal protection, and gradual integration into Spanish society. But the implementation depends on colonial officials who understand that their own success requires maximizing, rather than minimizing indigenous productivity. By 1500, Isabella has transformed Spain from a regional European power into a global empire that spans multiple continents and controls trade routes connecting Europe, Africa, and America. The administrative systems she's created can govern territories from the Arctic to the tropics. The military innovations she's developed can defeat enemies ranging from European knights to American warriors. The economic networks she's established can move wealth and resources across thousands of miles of ocean. But the most remarkable aspect of Isabella's achievement isn't the scope of Spanish expansion. It's the speed with which she's accomplished the transformation. In less than 25 years, she's taken a kingdom that was barely capable of governing itself and turned it into an empire that dominates global politics. The changes she's implemented affect every aspect of Spanish society, from legal systems to religious practices to economic relationships. The transformation has come at enormous personal cost. Isabella has sacrificed relationships, compromised principles, and made decisions that have caused suffering to thousands of people. She's become isolated from normal human connections by the demands of wielding absolute power over diverse populations across multiple continents. But Isabella has also achieved something that no previous monarch in European history has accomplished. She's created an empire based on systematic planning rather than random conquest, administrative efficiency rather than personal charisma, and strategic vision rather than tactical opportunism. The Spanish empire she's built will outlast her own lifetime by centuries and influence global development in ways that are still visible today. The woman who began as a teenage princess fighting for recognition has become the architect of the first truly global empire in human history. But Isabella's story is far from over. The systems she's created are still evolving, the territories she's claimed are still being explored, and the consequences of her decisions are still rippling outward in ways that she's only beginning to understand. The Isabella of 1500 is no longer the idealistic young queen who believed that good intentions could overcome political obstacles. She's become a master of statecraft who understands that effective leadership requires making choices between competing values rather than trying to satisfy all moral imperatives simultaneously. She's learned that building empires requires accepting responsibility for consequences that extend far beyond original intentions. Yet Isabella remains committed to the vision that has guided her throughout her reign. She still believes that Spanish expansion serves divine purposes, that European civilization represents progress over alternative social systems, and that centralized monarchy provides better governance than feudal fragmentation. The methods she uses to pursue these goals have become more sophisticated and more ruthless, but the underlying objectives remain consistent. The final phase of Isabella's reign will test whether the empire she's built can survive the transition from personal rule to institutional governance. She's created systems that depend heavily on her own decision-making ability, her personal relationships with key administrators, and her reputation for competence and determination. The question that will define her legacy is whether Spanish imperial governance can function effectively under less capable successors. Isabella understands this challenge and has spent years preparing for it by creating institutions that can operate independently of particular rulers. The Council of the Indies, the Casa de Contratación, and the various colonial administrative systems all include checks and balances designed to prevent individual corruption or incompetence from destroying Spanish are only as strong as the people who imperial effectiveness. But institutions staff them, and the traditions that guide their operations. Isabella's greatest achievement may be that she's created not just an empire, but an imperial culture that will continue pursuing Spanish expansion and Spanish interests long after her own death. The administrators, soldiers, merchants, and colonists who serve the Spanish Empire have internalized Isabella's vision of Spanish greatness and Spanish destiny. The legacy of Isabella's reign extends far beyond the territories Spain controls or the wealth Spanish colonies generate. She's fundamentally altered the relationship between European monarchies and global politics. Before Isabella, European kingdoms competed primarily with neighboring states over limited territorial objectives. After Isabella, European powers compete globally for control over transcontinental trade networks, overseas resources, and strategic positions that affect multiple continents simultaneously. The transformation has made European politics both more complex and more consequential. Decisions made in Spanish palaces now affect populations in America and Africa as well as Europe. Military conflicts between European kingdoms now have global implications that extend far beyond the original causes of dispute. Economic policies implemented in European capitals now influence trade relationships and resource flows across entire oceans. Isabella has created the template for early modern imperialism that other European powers will spend the next 2 centuries trying to copy or counter. The Dutch, the French, the English, and eventually the Russians will all develop their own versions of global empire based on principles that Isabella pioneered. The competition between these imperial systems will define European politics and global development for centuries. But Isabella's influence extends beyond imperial governance to fundamental questions about political authority, religious identity, and cultural development. She's demonstrated that systematic administrative reform can transform weak kingdoms into powerful empires within a single generation. She's proven that religious commitment can be compatible with ruthless political calculation. She's shown that effective leadership requires balancing competing moral imperatives rather than adhering to absolute principles. The Spain that Isabella leaves behind is unrecognizable compared to the kingdom she inherited. The fragmented, war-torn, economically backward realm of her youth has become the most powerful and efficiently governed empire in the world. The transformation reflects not just Isabella's personal abilities, but her understanding that lasting political change requires comprehensive reform of institutions, cultures, and social relationships rather than superficial modifications to existing systems. Isabella's methods have created both admirers and critics throughout Europe and beyond. Supporters praise her for completing the Reconquista, funding Columbus's discoveries, and establishing Spanish global dominance. Critics condemn her for the Jewish expulsion, the encomienda system, and the cultural destruction that accompanies Spanish colonization. But both admirers and critics recognize that Isabella has fundamentally altered the trajectory of European and global development. The decisions she's made and the systems she's created will influence political relationships, economic structures, and cultural developments for centuries after her death. She's become one of the handful of historical figures whose individual actions have consequences that affect the entire course of human civilization. The teenage princess who refused an arranged marriage has become the queen who forged fire and steel into an empire that spans the globe. Isabella's story demonstrates that individual determination, strategic intelligence, and ruthless pragmatism can overcome apparently insurmountable obstacles and achieve objectives that seem impossible to conventional thinking. But Isabella's story also reveals the costs and contradictions inherent in wielding absolute power over diverse populations across vast territories. The empire she's built requires constant vigilance, systematic coercion, and moral compromises that distance rulers from the very people they claim to serve. The price of global dominance is the transformation of leaders into instruments of institutional power rather than representatives of human values. The question remains whether Isabella's extraordinary achievements represent triumph or tragedy, and the answer lies in understanding what happens when absolute power meets human limitation. By 1504, Isabella has reached the pinnacle of earthly authority, but she's also confronting the reality that even the most successful rulers cannot control the forces they unleash. The first cracks in Isabella's imperial design become visible through her own family. She has 5 children, each representing a carefully planned piece in her grand strategy for European dominance. Catherine will marry Henry VIII of England, creating an alliance that should secure Spain's northern flank. Joanna will inherit Castile and continue Isabella's domestic reforms. Juan will rule Aragon and maintain the unity Isabella forged with Ferdinand. Maria will strengthen ties with Portugal through marriage. Isabella will serve as a backup heir and diplomatic asset. But human beings refuse to behave like chess pieces, and Isabella discovers that controlling kingdoms is simpler than controlling children. Juan dies suddenly in 1497, destroying Isabella's succession plans and leaving Joanna as the primary heir. Joanna shows disturbing signs of mental instability that make her unsuitable for the demands of imperial governance. Catherine's marriage to Henry becomes a diplomatic disaster when Henry decides he needs a male heir more than he needs Spanish friendship. The personal tragedies force Isabella to confront the fundamental weakness in her entire system of government. She's created an empire that depends on competent, dedicated leadership at every level, from colonial administrators in America to royal successors in Europe. But competence and dedication cannot be inherited, and Isabella has no guarantee that future rulers will possess the abilities necessary to maintain what she's built. The problem becomes acute when Isabella realizes that Joanna's mental condition makes her incapable of the strategic thinking and ruthless decision-making that imperial governance requires. Joanna is intelligent and well-educated, but she cannot focus on political objectives for extended periods, and she becomes paralyzed by emotional crises that would barely distract a competent ruler. Isabella's solution reveals both her pragmatic brilliance and her growing desperation. She begins training Joanna's husband, Philip of Burgundy, to serve as the real power behind Joanna's nominal authority. Philip is ambitious, competent, and completely committed to expanding Habsburg influence through his marriage connection to Spanish imperial resources. But Philip's ambitions create new problems that Isabella didn't anticipate. He's not content to serve as a Spanish puppet who implements Isabella's policies under Joanna's name. He wants to use Spanish resources to advance Burgundian objectives that may conflict with Spanish interests. The marriage alliance Isabella arranged to strengthen her empire threatens to subordinate Spanish policy to foreign priorities. The conflict with Philip forces Isabella to recognize that her imperial system contains internal contradictions that will eventually destroy it, regardless of external threats. She's created an empire too large and complex for any single ruler to govern effectively, but she's also centralized authority to prevent the regional autonomy that would make decentralized governance possible. Spanish territories in Europe, Africa, and America all require different approaches to administration, military strategy, and economic development. But Isabella's centralized system makes it impossible for regional authorities to adapt their policies to local conditions without seeking approval from administrators who may not understand those conditions, and who certainly cannot respond quickly to changing circumstances. The administrative reports that reach Isabella's court in the early 1500s reveal the scope of the challenges facing Spanish imperial governance. Colonial governors in America request military reinforcements to deal with indigenous rebellions, but European commanders need those same troops to defend Spanish territories in Italy. American colonists demand more favorable trade policies to compete with Portuguese and French merchants, but those same policies would damage Spanish commercial interests in Europe and Africa. The most troubling reports concern the encomienda system that Isabella designed to govern indigenous populations in America. Colonial administrators report that Spanish colonists are systematically abusing their authority over indigenous workers, treating them as slaves rather than wards, despite explicit royal regulations forbidding such treatment. Isabella responds by creating additional layers of oversight designed to prevent abuse and ensure compliance with royal policy. She establishes special courts to hear indigenous complaints against Spanish colonists. She sends royal inspectors to investigate reports of mistreatment and corruption. She creates detailed procedures for monitoring colonial administration and punishing violations of royal law. But the new oversight systems create their own problems without solving the original issues. Royal inspectors sent from Spain often lack the local knowledge necessary to distinguish between legitimate colonial needs and illegal exploitation. Indigenous populations rarely trust Spanish courts enough to file formal complaints against their Spanish overlords. Colonial administrators learn to conceal abuse rather than eliminate it, creating elaborate false records that satisfy royal inspectors while continuing the exploitation that generates colonial profits. Isabella begins to understand that the moral compromises she made to build the Spanish Empire have created systematic problems that cannot be solved through administrative reform. The encomienda system functions as designed by extracting wealth from indigenous labor for Spanish benefit. The abuses aren't implementation failures, they're logical consequences of a system that prioritizes Spanish interests over indigenous welfare. The realization forces Isabella to confront the possibility that her greatest achievements may also be her greatest failures. The empire she's built has eliminated Spanish weakness and established Spanish dominance, but it's also created suffering on a scale that dwarfs the problems she originally set out to solve. The administrative efficiency she's so proud of has become an instrument for systematic oppression that affects millions of people across multiple continents. The psychological burden of this recognition begins to affect Isabella's health and decision-making ability. Courtiers notice that she's become more withdrawn and less decisive than in previous years. She spends increasing amounts of time in prayer and religious contemplation, seeking divine guidance for problems that seem to have no satisfactory solutions. But Isabella's religious turn isn't escapism or weakness. It's an attempt to find moral frameworks that can guide imperial policy when political calculation produces unacceptable results. She begins consulting theologians and moral philosophers about the ethical implications of Spanish colonization, seeking ways sations produce sophisticated imperial necessity Spanish rule with Christian virtue. They consult theological arguments that justify to reconquer over indigenous populations while imposing strict limitations on how that rule should be exercised. Spanish authority over American territories serves divine purposes by exposing indigenous peoples to Christianity and European civilization. But Spanish colonists have moral obligations to treat indigenous populations with respect and protect them from exploitation. Isabella attempts to implement these theological principles through new colonial regulations that strengthen indigenous protections while maintaining Spanish control. The laws of Burgos, issued in 1512, require Spanish colonists to provide religious education, fair wages, and adequate working conditions for indigenous workers. The regulations also limit working hours, mandate rest periods, and establish procedures for indigenous people to appeal mistreatment. But the laws of Burgos reveal the fundamental impossibility of reconciling imperial exploitation with humanitarian protection. The regulations acknowledge that indigenous people have rights that must be respected, but they also maintain that Spanish colonists have authority that must be obeyed. The contradictions create legal frameworks that appear humanitarian while functioning oppressively. Colonial administrators interpret the laws of Burgos as requiring superficial changes in colonial procedures rather than fundamental reforms in colonial relationships. They provide religious education that serves Spanish interests rather than indigenous needs. They pay wages that appear fair but are calculated to maintain indigenous dependence rather than promote indigenous independence. They establish appeal procedures that favor Spanish testimony over indigenous complaints. The failure of the laws of Burgos to achieve their intended humanitarian objectives forces Isabella to recognize that good intentions cannot overcome systemic contradictions. Her empire requires indigenous labor to generate the wealth that maintains Spanish power, but humane treatment of indigenous workers would reduce colonial profitability and potentially threaten Spanish imperial sustainability. Isabella's final years are marked by increasingly desperate attempts to resolve contradictions that may be inherent in the imperial system she's created. She establishes new institutions designed to protect indigenous rights, but those institutions operate within legal and political frameworks that prioritize Spanish interests. She creates new oversight mechanisms designed to prevent colonial abuse, but those mechanisms depend on Spanish administrators whose careers benefit from colonial success rather than indigenous welfare. The most tragic aspect of Isabella's late reign is her growing awareness that the empire she's built will outlast her ability to control it. The administrative systems she's created are functioning according to their own institutional logic, rather than her personal intentions. The colonial relationships she's established are developing according to economic and political pressures rather than moral principles. Spanish colonists in America have become a distinct social group with interests that sometimes conflict with peninsular Spanish policy. They depend on indigenous labor for their economic survival. They understand local conditions better than administrators in Spain, and they have developed cultural attitudes that justify exploitation as necessary for colonial development. The emergence of a distinct Spanish colonial identity creates new challenges for imperial governance that Isabella never anticipated. Colonial loyalty to Spain remains strong, but it's conditional on Spanish policies that support rather than restrict colonial interests. When royal regulations interfere with colonial profitability, colonists find ways to circumvent or ignore those regulations while maintaining formal obedience to royal authority. Isabella's attempts to strengthen royal control over colonial administration produce increasing resistance from colonists who argue that distant administrators cannot understand local needs or make effective policy for territories they've never visited. The colonists aren't challenging Spanish sovereignty, but they're asserting the right to interpret royal policy according to colonial circumstances. The tension between peninsular control and colonial autonomy will eventually destroy the Spanish Empire. But Isabella cannot foresee that outcome, because she's still thinking in terms of personal rule rather than institutional development. She assumes that future Spanish monarchs will possess the competence and dedication necessary to maintain centralized control over global territories. But Isabella's own experience demonstrates the impossibility of maintaining personal control over an empire that spans multiple continents and governs diverse populations with conflicting interests. Even with her extraordinary abilities and tireless dedication, she's losing control over policies and outcomes in territories that she nominally rules but cannot effectively govern. The administrative reports reaching Isabella's court in her final years reveal the scope of imperial challenges that are beyond any individual ruler's capacity to manage. Colonial governors request contradictory policies that cannot be simultaneously implemented. European allies demand Spanish support for objectives that conflict with Spanish colonial interests. American territories generate wealth that attracts European competitors who threaten Spanish monopolistic control. Isabella responds to these challenges with the same systematic approach she's used throughout her reign, but the problems have become too complex and too numerous for systematic solutions. Each policy decision creates new complications that require additional decisions, and the cascade of consequences extends across multiple continents and affects millions of people. The realization that she's created problems too large for any individual to solve forces Isabella to confront her own mortality in ways that transcend personal concerns about death. She's not just dying as an individual, she's leaving behind an empire that may not survive the transition to less capable successors. Isabella's final political acts focus on creating institutional safeguards designed to preserve Spanish imperial unity after her death. She establishes detailed succession procedures that should prevent civil wars over royal inheritance. She creates administrative councils with authority to maintain policy continuity during transitions between monarchs. She negotiates international agreements that should protect Spanish interests regardless of changes in Spanish leadership. But Isabella also recognizes that institutions cannot substitute for the personal qualities that effective imperial governance requires. Her successors will need strategic intelligence, moral courage, and ruthless pragmatism to maintain an empire that faces constant internal and external challenges. They will need to make decisions that balance competing interests across multiple continents while maintaining Spanish unity and Spanish dominance. The tragedy of Isabella's situation is that she's succeeded too completely in centralizing Spanish authority around her own person. The empire she's built depends on competent central leadership that her successors may not be able to provide. The administrative systems she's created require coordination and oversight that future monarchs may not possess the ability or dedication to maintain. Isabella's death in November 1504 marks the end of one of the most successful reigns in European history, but it also begins the slow dissolution of the empire she spent her life building. The institutional frameworks she created will survive for centuries, but they will never again function with the efficiency and effectiveness that characterized her personal rule. The woman who transformed a weak medieval kingdom into a global empire has also revealed the fundamental limitations of personal monarchy in an age of institutional complexity. Isabella's extraordinary achievements demonstrate what individual determination and intelligence can accomplish, but they also show that even the most capable rulers cannot solve the contradictions inherent in governing diverse populations across vast territories. Her legacy extends far beyond the Spanish Empire to influence fundamental questions about political authority, imperial governance, and the relationship between moral intentions and political consequences. Isabella proved that systematic reform can transform weak states into powerful empires within a single generation, but she also demonstrated that power creates responsibilities that no individual can fully comprehend or control. The fire and steel that Isabella forged into an empire will continue burning long after her death, but the flames will consume Spanish resources and Spanish unity, as well as Spanish enemies. The empire she built to solve Spain's problems will create new problems that will eventually prove more challenging than the original weaknesses she set out to eliminate. Isabella of Castile remains one of history's most successful monarchs, but her story reveals both the possibilities and the perils of absolute power in human hands. She achieved objectives that seemed impossible to her contemporaries, but she also unleashed forces that would ultimately prove impossible for her successors to control. The queen who forged fire and steel created an empire that would reshape the world, but she also created contradictions that would eventually tear that empire apart. Her final years were marked not by the triumph of achievement, but by the growing recognition that even the most extraordinary human abilities have limits that cannot be overcome through determination or intelligence. Isabella had become the most powerful ruler in the world, but she had also learned that power itself creates problems that power cannot solve. The teenage princess who refused an arranged marriage had become the architect of global empire, but she had also discovered that building empires requires accepting responsibility for consequences that extend far beyond original intentions and far beyond any individual's capacity to control or predict. Isabella's greatest achievement was also her greatest burden, and her story demonstrates both the glory and the tragedy of wielding ultimate power over human destiny. The woman who had conquered kingdoms and reshaped continents was about to face her most devastating defeat, and it wouldn't come from any foreign army or political rival. It would come from within her own family in the form of a daughter whose mind was fracturing under the weight of imperial expectations. Joanna's condition had been deteriorating for months, but Isabella had been too busy managing global crises to fully comprehend what was happening. The signs were there for anyone willing to see them. Joanna would spend hours staring at portraits of her deceased brother Juan, talking to him as if he were still alive. She refused to change clothes for weeks at a time, claiming that washing them would wash away her connection to the dead. She became convinced that courtiers were poisoning her food and would only eat meals prepared by servants she had personally selected. But the breaking point came during a diplomatic reception in 1503 when Joanna suddenly began screaming at the French ambassador, accusing him of being in league with demons who were trying to steal her children's souls. The entire court watched in horror as the future Queen of Spain had to be physically restrained and carried from the room while she continued shrieking about supernatural conspiracies. Isabella found herself facing a nightmare scenario that no amount of political genius could solve. The daughter who was supposed to inherit the most powerful empire in the world was clearly incapable of governing herself, let alone governing territories that stretched from Europe to America. But acknowledging Joanna's mental illness publicly would create a succession crisis that could tear the Spanish Empire apart. The immediate problem was Philip of Burgundy, who saw opportunity in his wife's condition. He began making quiet overtures to Spanish nobles, suggesting that he could serve as regent for Joanna and provide the stable leadership that Spain needed. But Isabella recognized that Philip's regency would essentially make the Spanish Empire a subsidiary of Burgundian interests, undoing everything she had worked to achieve. The confrontation between Isabella and Philip reveals the full complexity of the crisis facing Spanish imperial succession. Philip argues that Joanna's condition makes her unfit to rule and regged that regency represents the only practical solution to the succession problem. Isabella counters that Joanna's illness is temporary and that foreign regenciate that would violate fundamental principles of Spanish sovereignty. But both Isabella and Philip know that the real issue isn't Joanna's fitness to rule. It's the question of whether Spanish imperial policy will be determined by Spanish interests or Habsburg ambitions. Philip wants to use Spanish resources to advance Burgundian objectives in European politics. Isabella has spent her entire reign preventing exactly this kind of foreign influence over Spanish decision-making. The negotiations become a battle of wills between two master politicians who understand that the outcome will determine the future direction of European politics. Philip has the advantage of legal authority as Joanna's husband and the father of her children. Isabella has the advantage of institutional control over Spanish administrative systems and the loyalty of Spanish officials who owe their positions to her patronage. Isabella's strategy reveals her sophisticated understanding of the relationship between formal authority and practical power. She doesn't challenge Philip's legal rights as Joanna's husband, but she creates administrative obstacles that make it impossible for him to exercise those rights effectively. Spanish treasury officials refuse to provide Philip with financial information, claiming they can only discuss such matters with Isabella personally. Military commanders insist that they can only take orders from Isabella or her designated representatives. The bureaucratic resistance frustrates Philip, but it also demonstrates to Spanish nobles that Isabella retains effective control over imperial governance, regardless of formal succession arrangements. Philip may have legal authority over Joanna, but Isabella controls the institutional mechanisms that actually govern the Spanish Empire. The struggle intensifies when Philip attempts to gain support from European allies who see opportunity in Spanish succession uncertainty. The French offer military assistance in exchange for Spanish concessions in Italy. The English suggest they might support Philip's regency if Spain agrees to more favourable trade terms. Even the Pope indicates willingness to provide ecclesiastical support for arrangements that serve broader Catholic interests. Isabella responds to these diplomatic pressures with the same systematic approach she's used throughout her career. She reminds France that Spanish military power in Italy serves French interests by preventing Habsburg domination of the peninsula. She points out to England that Spanish wealth from America depends on stable governance that foreign interference would undermine. She argues to the Pope that Spanish expansion has served Catholic interests better than any other European power's policies. The diplomatic campaign succeeds because Isabella's arguments are based on practical interests rather than sentimental appeals. European powers support Spanish stability because Spanish instability would create problems that affect their own security and prosperity. Philip's efforts to gain foreign support backfire because they make him appear to be a foreign threat to Spanish independence rather than a legitimate Spanish ruler. But Isabella's political success cannot solve the underlying human tragedy that's destroying her family. Joanna's condition continues deteriorating despite the best medical care available in 16th century Europe. She begins experiencing hallucinations that make her violent towards servants and suspicious of everyone around her. She refuses to see her own children, claiming that they've been replaced by demonic imposters who are trying to deceive her. The personal anguish Isabella feels watching her daughter's mental collapse is compounded by the political implications of Joanna's illness. Every public episode makes it more obvious that Joanna cannot function as a ruler, but every acknowledgement of her incapacity strengthens Philip's position and weakens Spanish independence. Isabella attempts to find medical solutions that might restore Joanna's mental stability. She consults physicians throughout Europe, seeking treatments that might cure or at least manage Joanna's condition. She brings religious healers to court, hoping that prayer and spiritual intervention might succeed where medical treatment has failed. She even considers consulting practitioners of folk medicine, despite her usual skepticism about non-Christian healing methods. But 16th century medicine has no effective treatments for the kind of mental illness Joanna is experiencing. The physicians can describe her symptoms and theorize about their causes, but they cannot provide treatments that produce lasting improvement. The religious healers offer spiritual comfort, but they cannot restore Joanna's connection to reality. The folk remedies provide temporary relief from some symptoms, but they cannot address the underlying psychological problems. Isabella begins to understand that Joanna's illness represents a type of problem that political power cannot solve. She has spent her entire career believing that sufficient determination and intelligent planning can overcome any obstacle. But mental illness operates according to rules that don't respond to political pressure or administrative efficiency. The realization forces Isabella to confront fundamental questions about the nature of power and the limits of human control. She has built an empire by refusing to accept defeat and finding solutions to apparently impossible problems. But Joanna's condition cannot be conquered through military force, negotiated through diplomatic skill, or managed through administrative reform. The psychological impact on Isabella is profound and visible to everyone around her. She begins spending more time in private prayer, seeking divine guidance for a situation that seems to have no earthly solution. She becomes more withdrawn from court activities, delegating responsibilities that she previously handled personally. She starts making arrangements for her own death, recognizing that she may not live to see resolution of the succession crisis. But even while grappling with personal tragedy, Isabella continues functioning as an effective ruler. She maintains Spanish imperial policies, manages ongoing colonial developments, and handles diplomatic relationships with the same competence that has characterized her entire reign. The personal crisis doesn't diminish her political effectiveness, but it adds a layer of melancholy to her decision-making that wasn't present in earlier years. The administrative reports reaching Isabella during this period reveal the scope of imperial challenges that continue regardless of succession uncertainties. Colonial governors in America request guidance about managing indigenous populations that are becoming increasingly resistant to Spanish authority. European allies demand Spanish military support for campaigns that would require resources Spain can ill afford to commit. Trade networks throughout the Spanish Empire need coordination and oversight that requires consistent royal attention. Isabella handles these ongoing responsibilities while simultaneously managing the succession crisis, demonstrating the extraordinary demands placed on early modern monarchs who governed global empires. She cannot delegate imperial decision-making because the consequences affect millions of people across multiple continents, but she also cannot ignore family crises that threaten the political foundations of everything she's built. The solution Isabella develops reveals both her practical intelligence and her growing acceptance of limitations beyond her control. She begins creating institutional arrangements designed to function effectively, regardless of who occupies the throne. The Council of Castile receives expanded authority to handle domestic administrative issues. The Council of the Indies gains increased autonomy over American colonial policy. Regional administrators throughout the Spanish Empire are given more discretionary authority to respond to local conditions without seeking approval from the royal court. These administrative reforms represent a fundamental shift in Isabella's approach to imperial governance. Throughout her career, she has insisted on centralized control and personal oversight of major policy decisions. Now she's creating systems that can function without constant royal intervention, recognizing that future monarchs may not possess the ability or dedication to maintain the level of personal involvement that has characterized her reign. The institutional changes are presented as administrative efficiency improvements, but they actually represent Isabella's recognition that the Spanish Empire has become too large and complex for any individual ruler to govern effectively. The decentralization she's implementing contradicts her lifelong commitment to centralized monarchy, but it may be the only way to preserve Spanish imperial unity under less capable successors. The irony of Isabella's situation is that her success in building a global empire has created problems that require solutions she has always opposed. The regional autonomy she's granting to colonial administrators could eventually lead to the independence movements that will destroy the Spanish Empire centuries later. But without such autonomy, the empire might collapse immediately under rulers who lack her exceptional abilities. Isabella's final major policy initiative concerns the treatment of indigenous populations in American territories. The reports from colonial administrators make it increasingly clear that the encomienda system is failing to achieve its intended humanitarian objectives while creating systematic oppression that threatens long-term Spanish interests. Indigenous populations throughout Spanish America are responding to exploitation and abuse with increasingly organized resistance. Some groups are forming military alliances designed to drive Spanish colonists out of their territories entirely. Others are developing economic strategies that reduce their dependence on Spanish colonial systems. Still others are adopting European technologies and tactics that make them more effective opponents of Spanish expansion. Isabella recognizes that indigenous resistance represents both a moral failure and a practical threat to Spanish colonial sustainability. The humanitarian principles she intended to implement through the encomienda system have been systematically violated by Spanish colonists who prioritize short-term profits over long-term stability. The indigenous populations that were supposed to benefit from Spanish rule have instead been subjected to exploitation that generates justified resentment and organized opposition. Her response to this crisis reveals the evolution of her thinking about imperial governance and moral responsibility. Instead of simply issuing new regulations that might be ignored like previous humanitarian directives, Isabella begins developing comprehensive reforms designed to create sustainable relationships between Spanish colonists and indigenous populations. The new laws of 1512 represent Isabella's most ambitious attempt to reconcile imperial necessity with humanitarian principles. The regulations establish detailed procedures for protecting indigenous rights while maintaining Spanish authority. They create legal mechanisms for indigenous people to seek redress for mistreatment without challenging Spanish sovereignty. They impose strict limitations on colonial labor practices while ensuring that Spanish economic interests remain protected. But the new laws also reveal the fundamental contradictions inherent in Isabella's imperial system. The regulations acknowledge that indigenous people have inherent rights that must be respected, but they also maintain that Spanish colonists have legitimate authority that must be obeyed. The legal frameworks created by the laws are designed to appear humanitarian while functioning in ways that preserve Spanish dominance. Colonial administrators interpret the new laws as requiring cosmetic changes in colonial procedures rather than fundamental reforms in colonial relationships. They establish legal courts that hear indigenous complaints, but consistently rule in favor of Spanish colonists. They create educational programs that teach indigenous people Spanish language and Christian religion while suppressing indigenous cultural practices. They implement wage systems that appear to provide fair compensation, but actually maintain indigenous economic dependence. The failure of the new laws to achieve their humanitarian objectives forces Isabella to confront the possibility that the contradictions in her imperial system cannot be resolved through administrative reform. The Spanish Empire requires indigenous labor and resources to generate the wealth that maintains Spanish power, but humane treatment of indigenous populations would reduce colonial profitability and potentially threaten Spanish imperial sustainability. Isabella's growing awareness of these contradictions contributes to the psychological burden that affects her final years. She has spent her entire career believing that intelligent planning and moral commitment can overcome any obstacle. But the imperial system she's created seems to function according to its own logic, rather than her personal intentions. The realization that she cannot control the consequences of her own policies represents a fundamental challenge to Isabella's worldview and self-understanding. She has always seen herself as the architect of Spanish greatness, personally responsible for the empire's achievements and personally capable of correcting its failures. The recognition that the empire now operates independently of her intentions and beyond her control forces her to question assumptions that have guided her entire reign. But even while grappling with these philosophical challenges, Isabella continues making practical decisions designed to preserve Spanish imperial unity and effectiveness. She negotiates new trade agreements that strengthen Spanish commercial networks. She authorizes military campaigns that extend Spanish territorial control. She establishes diplomatic relationships that protect Spanish interests in European politics. The contradiction between Isabella's growing doubts about imperial morality and her continued commitment to imperial expansion reflects the complexity of her position and the impossibility of simple solutions to the problems she faces. She cannot abandon the imperial project without destroying everything she has worked to achieve, but she also cannot ignore the moral costs that imperial success has created. Isabella's final months are marked by intense preparation for her death and its aftermath. She creates detailed instructions for her successors about managing ongoing imperial challenges. She establishes financial arrangements designed to ensure imperial stability during the succession transition. She negotiates agreements with European allies that should protect Spanish interests, regardless of changes in Spanish leadership. But Isabella also spends increasing amounts of time in religious contemplation, seeking spiritual guidance for questions that political analysis cannot answer. She consults theologians about the moral implications of imperial policies. She examines her conscience about decisions that have caused suffering to innocent people. She prepares her soul for divine judgment on a life that has achieved unprecedented worldly success at enormous human cost. The religious dimension of Isabella's final period isn't escapism or weakness, but rather an attempt to find meaning and justification for a career that has produced both extraordinary achievements and troubling contradictions. She genuinely believes that Spanish expansion serves divine purposes, but she also recognizes that her methods have caused suffering that cannot be easily justified by appeals to religious mission. Isabella's death on November 26, 1504, marks the end of an era in European and global history. The woman who had transformed a weak medieval kingdom into a global empire left behind institutional frameworks that would influence world development for centuries. But she also left behind unresolved contradictions that would eventually contribute to the empire's destruction. The immediate aftermath of Isabella's death reveals both the strength and the fragility of the system she created. Spanish imperial administration continues functioning effectively because the institutional frameworks she established can operate independently of particular rulers. But succession disputes and policy disagreements immediately begin undermining the unity and effectiveness that characterized her personal rule. Joanna's mental condition makes it impossible for her to provide effective leadership, confirming Isabella's worst fears about the succession crisis. Philip of Burgundy attempts to assert control over Spanish policy, creating exactly the kind of foreign influence that Isabella spent her career preventing. The tension between centralized control and regional autonomy that Isabella managed through personal authority becomes a source of ongoing conflict under less capable successors. The Spanish Empire that Isabella built will survive for centuries, but it will never again achieve the efficiency and effectiveness that characterized her reign. The administrative systems she created will function, but they will function according to their own institutional logic rather than comprehensive strategic vision. The territorial control she established will persist, but it will be maintained through coercion rather than the combination of force and legitimacy that she developed. Isabella's legacy extends far beyond the Spanish Empire to fundamental questions about political authority, imperial governance, and the relationship between individual leadership and institutional development. She proved that extraordinary personal qualities can transform weak states into powerful empires within a single generation. But she also demonstrated that empires built around individual leadership face inevitable crises when that leadership is no longer available. The woman who refused an arranged marriage and fought a civil war to claim her throne had become the architect of Spanish greatness and Spanish tragedy. She had shown what individual determination and intelligence could accomplish, but she had also revealed the limitations that even the most capable rulers cannot overcome. Isabella of Castile remains one of history's most successful monarchs, but her story illustrates both the possibilities and the perils of wielding absolute power in a complex world. She achieved objectives that seemed impossible to her contemporaries, but she also created problems that would prove impossible for her successors to solve. The fire and steel she forged into an empire would continue burning long after her death, but the flames would consume Spanish unity as well as Spanish enemies. Her transformation from teenage princess to global empress demonstrates the extraordinary potential of human ambition, guided by intelligence and determination. But her final recognition of the moral costs and practical limitations of imperial power reveals the tragic dimension inherent in all attempts to impose human will on historical forces larger than any individual can fully comprehend or control. The queen who forged fire and steel had created something that would outlast her own lifetime and influence world development for centuries. But she had also learned that even the most extraordinary achievements come with consequences that extend far beyond original intentions and far beyond any individual's capacity to predict or manage. Isabella's greatest triumph was also her greatest burden, and her story remains both an inspiration and a warning about the price of unlimited ambition in human hands. The legacy Isabella left behind was about to be tested in ways she never could have anticipated, because the empire she built on fire and steel was about to discover just how fragile human institutions really are when they collide with forces beyond any ruler's control. The year is 1505, and the Spanish court is buzzing with rumors that nobody dares speak aloud. Joanna has been locked away in her chambers for 3 days, refusing to eat, refusing to see her children, and according to the servants who brave entering her rooms, she's been having conversations with invisible companions who give her detailed instructions about governing the empire. Philip of Burgundy paces the corridors like a caged wolf, calculating how quickly he can consolidate power before the other European monarchs realize that Spain's iron-fisted control is cracking from within. But here's what makes this situation absolutely terrifying for everyone involved. The Spanish Empire isn't just some regional kingdom that can stumble along with weak leadership for a few years until things sort themselves out. This is a global machine that requires constant decision-making, instant responses to crises happening simultaneously on different continents, and the kind of ruthless efficiency that only comes from someone who understands exactly how all the pieces fit together. Ships are arriving daily from the Americas with reports of indigenous uprisings that require immediate military response. Colonial governors are demanding answers to questions about taxation, territorial disputes, and resource allocation that affect millions of people. European allies are pressing Spain for commitments to military campaigns that could reshape the entire balance of continental power. And every single one of these decisions has consequences that ripple across oceans and affect the lives of populations that most Europeans can't even imagine. The first major crisis hits in March 1505, when a messenger arrives from Hispaniola with news that makes the entire council chamber fall silent. The Taíno people, who had been relatively peaceful under Spanish rule, have formed a confederation with other indigenous groups and launched coordinated attacks on Spanish settlements throughout the island. They're not just raiding for supplies or trying to drive out individual colonists. They're systematically targeting the administrative centers, the religious missions, and the economic infrastructure that maintains Spanish control. Now, under Isabella's rule, This kind of crisis would have been handled with devastating efficiency. She would have analysed the political causes behind the uprising, identified the military resources needed to suppress it, calculated the economic costs of different response strategies, and implemented a solution that eliminated the immediate threat while preventing future rebellions. The entire process would have taken weeks, not months, and the result would have strengthened rather than weakened Spanish colonial authority. But Isabella is gone. Joanna is incapable of making coherent decisions, and Philip is more interested in European politics than American colonies. The crisis response becomes a bureaucratic nightmare where different government councils issue contradictory orders, military commanders receive conflicting instructions, and colonial administrators are left to make life and death decisions without any clear guidance about Spanish policy or objectives. The delay in responding to the Hispaniola uprising has consequences that extend far beyond that single island. Indigenous groups throughout the Caribbean and along the American mainland hear about Taíno military, Spanish colon successes, and begin organizing their own resistance movements. Start questioning whether the crown can actually protect them from indigenous attacks. And some begin making private deals with local leaders that undermine official Spanish authority. But the most dangerous consequence is psychological rather than military. The Spanish Empire has always depended on the perception that Spanish power is inevitable and Spanish authority is absolute. Indigenous populations, European rivals, and Spanish colonists themselves all need to believe that challenging Spain is hopeless and cooperation with Spain is the only rational choice. The slow, confused response to the Hispaniola crisis creates doubts about Spanish competence that spread faster than any military defeat. European observers are paying very close attention to how Spain handles its first major crisis since Isabella's death. The French court is particularly interested because French expansion into Italy depends partly on Spanish distraction with colonial problems. The English are watching to see whether Spanish control of Atlantic trade routes might be vulnerable to challenge. Even the Portuguese, who have generally maintained friendly relationships with Spain, are wondering whether Spanish weakness might create opportunities for Portuguese expansion in disputed territories. Philip of Burgundy finally asserts direct control over Spanish policy in June 1505, but his approach reveals exactly why Isabella was so determined to prevent foreign influence over Spanish decision-making. Instead of developing comprehensive strategies that serve Spanish interests, Philip makes decisions designed to advance Burgundian objectives in European politics. He pulls military resources away from American colonies to support Burgundian campaigns in the Low Countries. He redirects American wealth toward European projects that benefit Habsburg family interests, rather than Spanish imperial development. The shift in priorities becomes obvious to everyone involved in Spanish colonial administration. Colonial governors receive instructions that seem disconnected from colonial realities and colonial needs. Spanish merchants find that trade policies are being modified to benefit Burgundian commercial interests, rather than Spanish economic development. Spanish military commanders discover that their strategic planning must accommodate Burgundian political objectives that may conflict with effective colonial defense. The resistance to Philip's policies begins quietly, but spreads rapidly throughout the Spanish administrative system. Colonial administrators start interpreting royal orders according to their understanding of Spanish interests, rather than literal compliance with instructions that seem to serve foreign objectives. Spanish merchants begin developing commercial relationships that bypass official channels controlled by Burgundian officials. Military commanders quietly maintain strategic plans that prioritize Spanish territorial security over Burgundian political ambitions. This bureaucratic resistance reveals both the strength and the weakness of the administrative system Isabella created. The strength is that Spanish officials understand Spanish interests well enough to preserve essential imperial functions, even when royal policy becomes confused or contradictory. The weakness is that bureaucratic resistance to royal authority establishes precedents that could eventually undermine the centralized control that holds the empire together. The situation becomes even more complex when news arrives that changes everything anyone thought they understood about European politics. Philip of Burgundy dies suddenly in September 1506, leaving Joanna as the sole ruler of Spain, but in no condition to actually govern anything. The succession crisis that Isabella had been trying to prevent has arrived in the worst possible form, with no clear authority figure capable of making the decisions that global empire requires. Spanish nobles immediately begin maneuvering for influence over the regency that will have to govern in Joanna's name. Some support Ferdinand of Aragon, arguing that his experience and proven competence make him the obvious choice to preserve Spanish unity. Others prefer a council of Spanish nobles who would prevent any single individual from accumulating too much power. Still others suggest that Joanna's young son Charles should be declared of age and crowned immediately, even though he's only 6 years old and has been raised in Burgundy with no understanding of Spanish culture or interests. Each of these options creates different problems that threaten Spanish imperial stability. Ferdinand's regency would maintain effective leadership, but it would also subordinate Castilian interests to Aragonese priorities and potentially alienate Castilian nobles who expect to participate in governing their own kingdom. A noble council would preserve Castilian autonomy, but it would also create the kind of fragmented authority that Isabella spent her entire career eliminating. Crowning young Charles would provide legitimate royal authority, but it would also guarantee years of regency government by officials who might pursue their own interests rather than Spanish imperial objectives. The debate over regency arrangements reveals fundamental tensions within the Spanish political system that Isabella's personal authority had suppressed but never resolved. Castilian nobles want recognition of their traditional rights and privileges that centralized monarchy had diminished. Aragonese officials expect their kingdom's contributions to Spanish success to be rewarded with continued influence over imperial policy. Colonial administrators demand consistent support for policies that serve American territorial development rather than European political objectives. Ferdinand eventually emerges as regent, but his authority depends on political compromises that weaken the centralized control Isabella had established. He has to grant concessions to Castilian nobles that reduce royal power over domestic policy. He has to accept limitations on his ability to redirect colonial resources toward European military campaigns. He has to work with advisory councils that can overrule his decisions if they believe those decisions conflict with regional interests. The compromise regency system functions well enough to maintain Spanish imperial operations, but it operates according to different principles than Isabella's personal monarchy. Instead of unified strategic vision implemented through centralized authority, Spanish policy becomes the result of negotiations between competing interest groups who prioritize their own objectives over comprehensive imperial development. The change in governmental style has immediate consequences for Spanish colonial administration. Colonial governors receive instructions that reflect political compromises rather than strategic analysis. Military commanders find their resource requests evaluated according to domestic political considerations rather than military necessity. Spanish merchants discover that trade policies are influenced by regional lobbying rather than economic efficiency. But the most significant consequence of Ferdinand's regency concerns the psychological foundation of Spanish imperial authority. Isabella had governed as if Spanish success was inevitable and Spanish authority was absolute. Her confidence in Spanish destiny convinced Spanish officials to attempt projects that seemed impossible and convinced Spanish enemies that resistance was hopeless. Ferdinand governs as if Spanish success depends on careful negotiation and Spanish authority requires constant justification. The difference in leadership style affects everything from military morale to diplomatic effectiveness. Spanish armies begin approaching battles with less confidence in their inevitable victory. Spanish diplomats find their negotiating positions weakened by perceptions that Spanish commitments might be modified by domestic political pressures. Spanish colonists start questioning whether royal support for their activities will continue regardless of changing political circumstances. The psychological shift becomes visible in colonial reports reaching the Spanish court throughout 1507 and 1508. Indigenous populations throughout Spanish America are becoming more assertive in challenging colonial policies they consider unjust or oppressive. They're not necessarily organizing military rebellions, but they're developing economic and social strategies that reduce their dependence on Spanish colonial systems while increasing their capacity for autonomous development. Spanish colonists are responding to indigenous assertiveness with increasing brutality, but they're also requesting more military support from the Crown and more favorable policies for colonial economic development. The requests reveal growing anxiety about colonial sustainability that wasn't present during Isabella's reign, when Spanish colonial success seemed automatic and permanent. European rivals are also adjusting their strategies in response to perceptions that Spanish imperial authority has become more negotiable and less absolute. French expansion into Italian territories accelerates because Spanish responses seem less decisive and less overwhelming than during Isabella's reign. English maritime activities in areas previously considered Spanish spheres of influence increase because Spanish naval responses appear more constrained by domestic political considerations. Even Portugal, which had generally accepted Spanish dominance in global exploration and colonization, begins challenging Spanish territorial claims in areas where the boundaries had never been precisely defined. Portuguese expeditions start pushing into territories that Spanish explorers had claimed but never effectively occupied, testing whether Spanish responses will match Spanish rhetoric about absolute territorial sovereignty. Ferdinand responds to these challenges with the same systematic competence he demonstrated throughout his partnership with Isabella. But he operates within political constraints that limit his ability to implement comprehensive solutions. He can address individual problems effectively, but he cannot pursue the kind of integrated strategy that characterized Isabella's approach to imperial governance. The fragmentation of Spanish policy becomes most obvious in the handling of colonial reform initiatives, designed to address ongoing problems with indigenous treatment and colonial administration. Different government councils propose conflicting solutions that reflect their particular perspectives and interests, rather than comprehensive analysis of colonial conditions and imperial objectives. The Council of Castile focuses on legal reforms that would strengthen royal authority over colonial administration and ensure better compliance with humanitarian regulations. The Council of the Indies emphasizes economic policies that would increase colonial profitability while reducing the costs of imperial governance. Regional noble councils advocate for policies that would increase their own influence over colonial appointments and commercial opportunities. Each of these approaches addresses real problems and reflects legitimate interests, but they cannot be implemented simultaneously without creating contradictory policies that satisfy nobody and solve nothing. Ferdinand finds himself mediating between competing reform proposals rather than developing unified policies that serve Spanish imperial interests comprehensively. The result is a series of partial reforms that modify colonial policies without fundamentally changing colonial relationships or resolving underlying tensions between Spanish interests and colonial realities. Indigenous populations receive additional legal protections that are offset by reduced enforcement mechanisms. Spanish colonists gain more economic freedoms that are balanced by increased administrative oversight. Colonial governors receive expanded authority that comes with additional restrictions on how that authority can be exercised. These compromise solutions prevent colonial crises from becoming colonial disasters, but they also establish patterns of policy making that prioritize political accommodation over strategic effectiveness. Spanish colonial administration becomes more responsive to competing interests, but less capable of pursuing long-term objectives that require short-term sacrifices or unpopular decisions. The administrative changes reflect broader transformations in Spanish governmental culture that extend far beyond colonial policy. The centralized decision-making that Isabella used to coordinate imperial policy across multiple continents gives way to decentralized negotiations that allow regional interests to influence imperial strategy. The unified strategic vision that guided Spanish expansion during Isabella's reign fragments into competing priorities that must be balanced rather than integrated. Ferdinand recognizes these problems and attempts to restore more centralized control over imperial policy, but he faces political realities that Isabella never had to confront. His authority depends on the consent of powerful interest groups who can withdraw their support if they believe he's ignoring their concerns or priorities. He cannot simply override domestic opposition the way Isabella did, because his political position is less secure and his personal authority is less absolute. The limitations on Ferdinand's authority become most apparent when he attempts to address the growing crisis in Spanish indigenous relations throughout the American colonies. Reports from colonial administrators make it increasingly clear that the encomienda system is generating systematic abuses that threaten long-term colonial stability, while violating the humanitarian principles that Spanish policy is supposed to implement. Ferdinand understands that effective reform requires comprehensive changes in colonial labor systems, legal frameworks, and economic relationships between Spanish colonists and indigenous populations. But implementing such changes would require overriding the interests of Spanish colonists who benefit from existing systems and Spanish merchants who profit from colonial economic arrangements. Under Isabella's reign, royal authority was sufficient to impose necessary reforms regardless of opposition from affected interest groups. Ferdinand's regency lacks that kind of absolute authority and must negotiate changes that satisfy competing interests, rather than simply implementing policies that serve imperial objectives. The negotiations produce reform proposals that acknowledge indigenous rights while protecting colonial economic interests, but the resulting policies are so complex and contradictory that colonial administrators struggle to understand what they're supposed to implement. Legal protections for indigenous workers are balanced by exceptions that allow continued exploitation under specific circumstances. Economic regulations designed to prevent abuse include loopholes that permit traditional practices under different legal classifications. The confusion in colonial policy creates opportunities for both Spanish colonists and indigenous populations to interpret regulations according to their own interests rather than royal intentions. Spanish colonists argue that their traditional practices comply with the letter of royal law even when they violate its spirit. Indigenous groups claim royal protection for activities that challenge Spanish authority while remaining technically legal under royal regulations. Ferdinand finds himself managing a colonial system that operates according to local interpretations of royal policy rather than centralized implementation of royal objectives. Spanish colonial administration functions, but it functions according to the priorities of people who live in the colonies rather than the strategic vision of people who govern the empire. The decentralization of imperial authority creates new opportunities for colonial development that wouldn't have existed under Isabella's more rigid, centralized system. Spanish colonists develop innovative approaches to economic development, social organization, and territorial expansion that reflect their understanding of local conditions and local opportunities. But decentralization also creates new vulnerabilities that threaten long-term imperial sustainability. Colonial policies that serve local interests may conflict with imperial strategic objectives. Regional developments that benefit particular territories may undermine imperial unity and imperial resource allocation. Local innovations that solve immediate problems may create future complications that affect imperial governance throughout Spanish territories. By 1510, the Spanish Empire has adapted to post-Isabella governance, but it operates according to fundamentally different principles than the system Isabella created. Imperial policy emerges from negotiations between competing interests rather than strategic analysis by centralized authority. Colonial administration reflects local priorities rather than imperial objectives. Military and diplomatic strategies accommodate domestic political constraints rather than pursuing optimal outcomes regardless of internal opposition. The adapted system functions effectively enough to maintain Spanish imperial operations and Spanish global influence, but it lacks the unified strategic vision and ruthless efficiency that characterized Isabella's reign. Spanish power remains formidable, but it's exercised through compromise and accommodation rather than absolute authority and comprehensive planning. The transformation reveals both the strengths and the limitations of the governmental system Isabella created. The institutional frameworks she established were sophisticated enough to function under less capable leadership, preventing imperial collapse when personal monarchy became impossible. But those same institutions were designed around centralized authority and unified strategic vision, making them less effective when political realities required decentralized decision-making and accommodated competing priorities. Ferdinand's regency demonstrates that effective governance can survive the transition from extraordinary personal leadership to more conventional institutional authority. But the transition involves costs and compromises that affect imperial effectiveness and imperial unity. The Spanish Empire remains powerful and influential, but it's no longer the unified strategic instrument that Isabella forged through fire and steel. The legacy of Isabella's reign persists in the institutional frameworks, territorial control, and global influence that continue to define Spanish imperial power. But her vision of absolute royal authority serving comprehensive strategic objectives has given way to more limited governmental ambitions that reflect the political realities of governing across vast, diverse interest territories. The woman who refused an arranged marriage and built a global empire had created something too large and complex for any individual successor to control completely. Her extraordinary achievements had established Spanish global dominance, but they had also created imperial responsibilities that required institutional solutions rather than personal leadership. The fire and steel Isabella forged into an empire continued burning, but the flames now served multiple masters rather than a single strategic vision. The Spanish empire she built would survive and prosper for centuries, but it would never again achieve the unified purpose and ruthless effectiveness that characterized her personal reign. And there you have it. Isabella of Castile transformed herself from a teenage princess who refused an arranged marriage into the architect of the world's first truly global empire. She forged fire and steel into a machine that conquered continents, reshaped civilizations, and established Spanish dominance for centuries to come. Her story proves that extraordinary determination and ruthless intelligence can overcome impossible odds and achieve what others consider unthinkable. Isabella didn't just become a queen, she became the woman who literally changed the course of human history forever.